thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Claire Imamura. I'm the Outreach Librarian here at the Alaska State Library. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Jackson Paulus, who's also known as Stephen Paul Jackson. We are so pleased to welcome him back to this institution. In 2009, he had a solo artist exhibit in our old building under the name Stron Softi, and it was an incredible installation exhibit that mixed different media, including carving, painting, digital art, and sculpture. Since then, he's gotten his BA in Art History and Visual Arts and an MFA in Visual Arts from Columbia University. He currently splits his time between New York and Ketchikan, is teaching at Columbia this fall, and is a Native Arts and Cultures Foundation 2017 Mentor Artist Fellow. So we're lucky he made time to be with us tonight, and now I'll turn it over to him.
First, I would like to call up someone else, Robert Mills.
Gunners Chish a Kwan yi ani kuk woosh would to denak Tlingit enach Gunnock achsai Glade Kach enach Robert Mills you hut to a sock Chak ka Zagwedi na Hutsati Yach Anshe Kauslitsachi hit Yida Hasati What's in a D de Hutsati Kachadi Dutch Khan Ayachat Kich Kwan Ayachat. I would like to thank the Ak Kwan people for welcoming me on their land. My Tlingit name is Gunnock. My English name is Robert Mills. I am an eagle from the Tsagwedi clan. I am from the house that anchors the village. I am a child of the Wet'suwet'en. I am a grandchild of the Kachadi, and I am from Cape, Alaska. Thank you.
This trip has got me thinking about territorial acknowledgement, the different forms it can take, the struggle for it, the ways in which it can occlude in some instances. It has been a tradition to acknowledge the territory and a current trend to acknowledge one's territory, the territory of the current indigenous inhabitants, the past members. This has always been part of Tlingit protocol. My struggle to say that word induces in me a bit of shame. My name is Stephen Jackson. I call myself Jackson Paulus on this occasion and maybe others. My father is Nathan Jackson of the Tlukak. I hope that you can register the struggle in saying that, the difficulty and the necessity of trying, regardless. I was adopted my mother is Dorica Jackson. She was raised in Seattle. She's not native. So it was some time before I was adopted into my grandfather's clan, the Duklawedi of the Kitgushi-Hit, and given the name Nakushta, the meanings of which many Tlingit speakers are still trying to ascertain. I also recognize the importance of reaching out to those who support us, reaching out to the opposite, our opposites. I did not do so with Robert. He is of the Eagle moiety. I've been thinking about this so-called shame pole and how it might introduce the opportunity to rethink some of our taking for granted of this kind of acknowledgement. of this kind of placing ourselves here. So I introduce and allow for that asymmetry because the piece that I'm talking about here is not necessarily a piece in which restitution has been offered. There's an openness which this project entails that I have become more interested in, and I hope that we can consider this together. In this, we acknowledge that we are in the United States of America, who claims to have purchased, who did purchase the territory we are now in. I am speaking on the so-called sesquicentennial, the anniversary of the purchase, and which has become a sort of origin story for many people who live here. There are similar concerns in Canada, in what is now called Canada, for people who are Indigenous people, who are having to fight against the celebration of that sesquicentennial. So for me, this piece offers an opportunity to kind of think about that and hold that. Today I've been held up by many people in the museum. I was at Sea Alaska Heritage Institute by Native people who I have known for some time, but don't get to see very often. I would like to acknowledge Paul Marks, who I saw today, of my father's clan, Tlukakadi, Rosita Whirl, who I spoke with today, Chuck Smythe. It's wonderful to see so many here who I know and so many who I do not know. It's wonderful to see Byron and Tony Malott here, who are part of how I arrived at being able to pursue Tlingit art. There are others here who I'm not seeing, and I apologize for not acknowledging, but I also hope that you understand that there are reasons for withholding. I've been thinking about withholding. Holding with each other and withholding information, which arose in this kind of the Seward project. The withholding that must occur when we look at some of our, when we have the opportunity to look at some of these clan objects, the not knowing of information and the kind of space that demands, that kind of attention that is different from the kind of space that we go into when we are reciting historical details that are claimed to be known. So, have I gone half hour already? So, in terms of the holdup, I would like to, I'm just going to get into this holdup and talk about, as an isolated instance, something that Rosita shared with me today, which I think will give us an opportunity to think about the difficulty of coming to terms with our histories. This was written by Rosita Whirl, dated July 31st, Slavery Among the Tlingit. She writes, "In planning for an exhibit, I consulted with a number of Tlingit and reported that a section of the exhibit would focus on slavery. One of the community members emphatically stated that we didn't have slaves, we had servants. I've told my students that we are prone to romanticizing our culture and history, but to understand the reality and complexity of our culture, we need to assess both the positive and negative aspects of our culture. In this instance, the reality is that slavery was a common practice among the Tlingit and all the tribes of the Northwest Coast. Estimates suggest that 1/3 of the Tlingit population during the mid-1800s were slaves. We did not fully understand the contribution of slaves to the development of our society until Leland Donald's 1997 study of slavery in the Northwest Coast of North America. His meticulously researched study revealed that slaves were important for their labor and their value in trade. He also found that slavery played a major role in the cultural forms such as potlatches, art production, and ritual activities. The slavery system in the United States, including the indigenous systems, legally ended with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which abolished slavery in 1865. However, it persisted among the Tlingit until the early 1900s. The Tlingit challenged the constitutional amendment in reciprocate, arguing in court as an Aboriginal group. They retained internal governing authority exclusive of laws of the United States. Because slaveholding was permitted under the Tlingit custom, and because they retained independent sovereignty, the Tlingits contended that federal laws prohibiting slavery did not apply to them. Sakwa was a Haida who reported that the Flathead Indians abducted him as a child after his parents, who were in Washington at the time, were killed. The Flatheads made him a slave and then sold him to the Stikines, who in turn sold him to the Shilkats. They in turn sold him to the Yakutats, who then sold him to Naki Klan, who was a resident of Sitka. Anna Hoots, a Sitka clan leader, presumably of the Kagwantan clan, testified that a male slave was worth 50 to 60 Hudson Bay blankets, while women were worth about half as much. Anna Hoots reported that they had captured slaves through raids. The Alaska Federal District Court rejected the sovereign authority of the Tlingit Indians to maintain the practice of slavery and held that the Tlingits, as residents of the United States, were subject to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. William L. Paul Sr. did extensive research on the so-called Lincoln Totem Pole in Ketchikan. This was in Ketchikan and Saxman, pole contiguous with the Seward pole. None of them knew any story. He did extensive research on the so-called Lincoln Totem Pole in Ketchikan and refuted the claims made by Judge Wickersham that the first Lincoln Totem Pole was made to honor President Abraham Lincoln for freeing the slaves. The image on the totem is certainly that of Lincoln, since a drawing or a photograph of Lincoln served as the model for the artist carving of the totem pole. However, the pole that was erected in 1883 at the Tongass village was carved to commemorate the sighting of the first white man. In 1922, Paul interviewed the Tlingit who had migrated from the Tongass village to Saxman years earlier. None of them knew any story of a Tongass pole being connected with the slavery issue. They did, however, speak of the proud raven pole. The pole had a raven at its base and a figure of a man wearing a stovepipe hat at the top. Ji of the Ganachadi clan commissioned a Tsimshian artist to carve the pole with his clan crest, the raven, to commemorate that he or one of his ancestors was the first Tlingit to see a white man. The carver needed an image of a white man and was given a photo of Lincoln that had been obtained from an officer of the Army stationed at Fort Tongass. The top of the deteriorated Tongass totem of the first white man seen by the Tongass Tlingit is now held in the Alaska State Museum here. A replica of the first Tongass pole was carved by the Civilian Conservation Corps and was erected in Saxman. Wickersham's invented story that the pole represents Lincoln apparently persists despite Paul's overwhelming evidence that the pole represents the first white man who was seen by the Tongass Tlingit. Paul offers that freed slaves would not have had the resources to carve a totem pole honoring Lincoln as worthy as this effort might have been. Although we honor our culture, we're not all proud of all aspects of our history. The reality is that slavery was a part of our culture and played a critical role in its development. Thank you, Rosita. for allowing me to read those words. Thinking about development is part of what I have thought of in terms of my own, it's been one of the guiding forces in terms of my own artistic trajectory, both in appreciation and desire for development, and a resistance of it. A resistance because it has the potential to impinge on us as Native people, because we have so often been identified as those who need to evolve. So this, for me, introduced a lot of uncertainty in terms of how I wanted to proceed. But I think that, for me, the uncertainty is important to hold up. I began my carving with my father, Nathan Jackson. This is the Saxman Native Village. This building was carved in 1989 to provide a place for the local carvers to do their work. It exists in the same spot that those Saxman, Lincoln, and Seward poles exist. So I grew up with these pieces around me. This piece, although I was I had already started carving just barely, right around this time I saw this. I held as, one of the finest examples of what I thought of neoclassical Tlingit art. One of the pieces that inspired me to begin a journey onto trying to raise a level of quality. This is what my father always talks about too. A level of quality beyond what is always seen. But here we are. This flag is not there now, but it's interesting for me to see this image and think about framing devices. The United States of America, that's who we've become. But our ability to withhold doesn't demand that that's all we are. My father worked in the presenting the culture. He's worked hard at it. This is at the looks like the Peabody Museum at Harvard. This was part of a ceremony in which they wanted Native people to come and be in the museum after items were repatriated. So I was aware of these kind of tensions at the time of how one is representing oneself. But this piece is the piece that I considered my first independent piece. It's here at the Gold Belt Tram. I started under a tent in the Gold Belt Hotel. I stayed with Byron Malott and his wife Tony Malott while trying to figure out how to carve for myself, to push things past a level that I had, and to honor the clans that were here in a story that required an immense amount of research. And this kind of was one of the ways in which I started thinking about research as separate, as something expected, something that was required because those objects, so many objects have been taken from us. Our language has been difficult to gain for many of us. And I spent much time with clan elders trying to find something that would bring these things together. There are a few detail shots of that piece. I won't go into the story at this time, just to give an idea of what I was thinking when I was in my early 20s when I made this piece. I began along that line, continuing This was the next year. And at this time, I was trying to push an abstract, an acceptance of abstract movements that are not often, that weren't, as far as my understanding at that time, weren't often depicted in form line, and to remove the representation of a specific clan animal, because I was so sensitive to the fact that when people see a clan animal, it's sometimes difficult to see beyond that, to see what's happening. And these are one of the things that, for me, growing up in, growing up carving behind the ropes in Saxman Native Village, where people want something easy to grab onto. For me, that was an important initial moment where I could start removing and withholding certain elements. Also thinking about the territoriality sometimes of the Tlingit people, which is sometimes not understood when you have people who want to claim that natives have no notion of property in addition to no word for art. That was a piece made, I'm not going to go into this piece right now. Had to do with blood quantum. So given that people were starting to notice this kind of style of carving that I just represented earlier, this piece was repatriated from the Harriman exhibition, as far as I understand. If I'm mistaken, please forgive me. It was repatriated to a group that went in and took this piece thinking or telling themselves that the village was abandoned. So it took a lot of work to get these pieces back from both the Smithsonian, the Field Museum, and the Burke Museum, among others. Where? Cornell in Chicago. Yeah, Field Museum in Chicago and Cornell in Ithaca, New York. So so they wanted a replacement for the one that was repatriated, brought back to the community, which was in Saxman at that time. And I'd been thinking about this, about giving back, the taking. If I were to give back the same thing, is that too easy? What is important for me to withhold? So I spent some time and I drew this sketch out, and I wrote a rather perhaps abstruse, perhaps poetic page of text, and sent it with this original drawing, which is about 8.5 by 11. I know that Rosita was partly responsible for allowing this to go through, for advocating that this be allowed to be made, and I'm thankful for that. But it took a long time to translate into this piece, which did not end up being in wood, given at that time my own technical limitations with wood. I instead made this out of clay first. It's about 25 different pieces of clay, and then molds that were made to be cast into epoxy resin, and then affixed to a slice of the log that Sealaska Timber Corporation had donated behind aluminum panel, whitewashed aluminum panel. So I should go into the story of this a little bit. This is the story of cots. There are some variations. There are even analogous versions in other Indigenous nations. but the stories of a man who married a bear and was eaten by his bear children for having gone to help his former human wife and children. For me, the visceral nature of that story was important to come through, and a recognition of the violence. Not only the violence of the story, but that could be related to the violence done to our culture due to those objects having been taken in the first place. So for me, this was a chance to introduce into the museum that had acquired and ingested us a reminder. At the same time, I wanted to develop as an artist. I wanted to advance. I wanted to, I don't think I was using the word evolve at the time, but I had been thinking about development. And for the same reasons of the expectation of evolution that I had indicated earlier, I was resistant to that, resistant to the thought that we had to evolve. But I wanted some of that resistance to inhere in this piece as well, while still retaining some kind of positive energy, to try to hold those things together in relation. Some details. This is their current placement at the Burke Museum in Seattle. Soon after this, I started making many different kinds of art: kinetic, mechanical art, some video. I started being interested in other forms besides carving, and submitted this piece to the All Alaska Juried Show. I believe it was 2008. This had an earlier version, a smaller version, in 2007. So some of these you can see I had included the logos. With this logo, maybe I should mention the silver hand. So the silver hand is administered, as far as I was aware of at the time, by the state of Alaska, and if a person is native, they can use this to ensure that it is not made by an outside, someone falsely claiming to be native or falsely trying to use native art for often what is seen as purely monetary incentives. So I was interested in that constriction, this kind of delimitation of what it encourages native artists to make, and also interested at that time in the designation handicraft, the expectation of someone who grows up as native thinking, what are they going to make? What can they do? I want to make, I guess maybe not an artist, maybe I'll make some handicraft. That kind of expectation is imposed from without, and it has a long history. Those kind of expectations have a long history. I'm not sure how true this is, but I saw this, so I don't know if my little piece, it was actually what ended up being in Anchorage was a huge poster. It was like 10 feet by 8 feet, a little overzealous, perhaps. But, they changed Alaska Native art, which I think is a good positive step, but I still think about how that control from the state governs what has the potential to be made. These are pieces from the show here at the Alaska State Museum under the name Stron Softi. The show was called Softi Pack. It was in the Governor's Gallery at the time, when Sarah Palin, I think, had just finished. So these pieces are black bear hides stapled to the wall. And I had been thinking about another stipulation by the state of Alaska, which requires that pieces of certain materials are required to be, if made by a native and then to be sold to a non-native, are required to be significantly altered. Now, what that is a little bit tricky to understand. What is significant alteration? It requires that someone use handicraft, right? Handicraft to traditionally stitch in the way that they presumably had done for millennia. Well, I was thinking about how that delimited the possibility of art in a mainstream contemporary sense, and how that constricts on the possibility of natives being held as contemporary. So a gestural ready-made could not be sold because it was made by materials that had been, I was living in New York at the time. I could not acquire these in, so I got these from Canada, had them shipped to me. Once I had them shipped to me, I could not mail them from Canada. I could not to New York. So I had them shipped to New York. Once I had them shipped to me in New York, I could not mail them to Alaska for this show. I had to take them on my person. And these are just black bear hides. Once I was here, I chose to transform them in this way, which was perhaps insignificant. So these pieces are called insignificantly altered. But it shows how much weight is put on that identity, right? And how it forms certain channels. I did a similar thing with polar bear. This was partly based on my going to a place, the Alaska House at the time, which was owned by Alice Rugoff Rubenstein. It was a short-lived venture. But I saw their pieces being exhibited by some of my friends, and also some people I didn't know, but among them were native handicrafts, so polar bear mittens. And I thought about who was buying these and why. This piece in particular was called Boat for the Future. It was affixed. I screwed the polar bear hide to this urethane mold of a canoe that my father had made. This is just half. There's a styrofoam piece that I found upland in the shores at high tide, like in the woods when the tide had reached that far. There are so many of these down in Ketchikan area. And these kind of quasi-form line designs. Kind of semi-automatic Photoshop filters that resembled form line. So I was stretching. I was trying to find the tension that could inhere in certain objects juxtaposed against one another. And I don't know if I have another view. So I also had a little tourist totem pole made in China, plastic pole inserted in the center. This is a piece in Ketchikan, which occurred around the same time as that show, in which I was thinking about appropriation. There are a lot of cruise ships come into Ketchikan, just like there are a lot of cruise ships that come to Juneau, and a lot of diamond stores. And I was thinking about representations, generic representations of things imbued with form line. And kind of desires for ingesting to be in control. And I was kind of thinking of appropriation. What would it look like if I kind of appropriated this myself? I took these items, which are clan items, put myself in into an uncomfortable position and gave them colors which are not thought of as traditional. Or in inserting the diamond, started to try to think about who is, is the raven capturing the diamond or being fed the diamond? Those kinds of things happening at the same time, perhaps. And I was thinking about exteriority, the ways in which my complicity with this kind of arrangement might be exterior, but underneath maybe there's something else entirely going on. But I'm going to jump to 2014. This is in the Saxman Native Village. It was June, during the summer. Sometime someone noticed about 8 a.m. that the Seward pole, the face was starting to lean. The face looked like it might be starting to sag, or what is happening here. So this was starting to happen kind of rapidly, so quickly. We got a lift, telescoping lift, and you can see by that time, by the lift, when the lift was there, how far the hat was leaning, how far the face was already almost off. There's a little bit better view. What's happening here? So we went up. Apparently it was a rot situation. By the time we got up there, I picked up the piece and just set it down in the lift. It was that separated from itself. So apparently also there was some kind of fiberglass or rags that were on top of the hat trying to fill out this space that apparently someone had noticed previously, and rot had overtaken it. And we weren't sure exactly when that had happened because it seemed like fiberglass was penetrating these claws, so we didn't know like if it was in the 60s or what. So I don't have all the photos of what happened that day because I was up there having to chainsaw. We took off the parts that we could, and then I had to chainsaw the piece. Start cutting it to bring it down because it was deemed a safety hazard for the tourists and for locals as well. I don't have the photos with me of the piece, but it was just kind of laid out in pieces on the sunny lawn that day. And eventually, this is what was left of it, bearing a similar fate to many pieces which are not shame poles, which are left in the city of Saxman situation to kind of lay out and disintegrate on their own terms. So it was deemed that this pole needed to be replaced. Was I interested in carving it? And there were other opportunities prior to this in the city of Saxman where pieces needed to be replaced, and I hadn't been as interested. But I also needed some income. And I was there to do the job because I thought, okay, this is a piece where there's kind of an interesting tension that I was interested in already, and perhaps I could do a few things at once here. So it took me a while to figure out. Sorry, I have some other notes here. So I should mention, this piece here, these are my later notes in which I took dimensions from it to try to figure out where to start in terms of remaking it. This piece was made in 1941. And thinking about research again, how's my time? How's my time? Okay. So I was aided in my research. Not only I reached out to Jim Simard, who is here, thank you, who gave me better versions of this photo. This one is a little bit pixelated. This was, I believe, from a different source, perhaps, but might be similar to the one Jim had available. So he had one that featured the Seward, that piece a little bit clearer, a better quality image. So this was the piece that was carved, apparently out was in the Tongass village in the 1880s. So I'm going to go through. I've been thinking about research, and Emily Moore, who is working on a book that's soon to be published at this time, has allowed me to use some of her notes for this talk. So I'm going to read for a little bit of an extended period, but I'd like to think about how our not knowing factors in. So the CCC replica of the Secretary of State poll was not completed. That second version, this version, was not completed until the spring of 1941. Interestingly, the Forest Service was not interested in the poll initially. The plain shaft with a single figure did not impress them on viewing it at Tongass in the fall of 1938, and apparently it was so deteriorated that they didn't want to bother moving it to Saxman. But they later learned of its significance from Viola Garfield, the University of Washington anthropologist who was contracted to gather stories for the Wolf and the Raven book, and to consult on the restoration project in general. That was when they decided to include a replica of it in the Saxman Park. Even then, it seems that it took a while to learn that the poll was a ridicule poll. Garfield knew it was called the Secretary of State or Seward poll, but she wasn't sure about the story. And here below, and I'll read through some of these, are what she has in her notes, Emily Moore has in her notes from the Forest Service correspondence. All letters are quoted are from the National Archives and Records Administration, Pacific Division, Record Group, Records of the Forest Service, Region 10, Alaska Region, correspondence relating to Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC of the 1937 to 1942. So the Seward poll from Tongass Island, the Wolf and the Raven says this was erected in 1885, 16 years after Seward's visit to Tongass Island. William Paul, who was mentioned earlier in Rosita's text, agrees with this in the true story of the Lincoln poll. It was never removed from Tongass during the CCC period. Brown made sketches of it in situ, January 31st, 1941, in order to carve replica for Saxman. Erected in Saxman Spring, 1941, seems to be the last totem pole erected at Saxman by CCC. See the Ketchikan Chronicle 22241 below. Now a memorandum for Archbold from Heinzelman from 1940. Dr. Garfield mentions to me that Old Tongass Village has a totem pole designated as the Secretary of State pole, which you found to be too far gone to recondition. Apparently this pole is of exceptional interest, and I suggest we make a special effort to duplicate it. Have it brought into town, in pieces if still necessary, if any part of the totemic design is still legible. A picture of the pole is available as one of a group in an article by Krager in the annual report of the Smithsonian Institution of 1927. I will ask Lynn Forrest to send it to you. Also, I wish Lynn and you would search for other and more detailed pictures of the pole before you start duplication work. So I started to realize that I was kind of in this same situation. I'm looking at photos. I'm looking for clues. I'm not really sure what's happening here. Please look for a memorandum for Lynn Forrest from Heinzelman. Please look for a picture film taken by Archbold at Tongass Village of the Secretary of State pole. A man at the top of the pole wears a hi-hat and is standing or sitting on a square box. He says this pole was too far gone to justify bringing it to Saxman for duplication. I told him I thought we should carve a duplicate pole from photographs. If you find Arch's films, send him some prints. If we cannot get sufficient information for the prints, I wish you could go to Tongass Village and sketch the figurines as far as Sketch the figures as far as possible from the original pole. Supplement this with data obtained from natives who are familiar with the pole. I hope you and Arch can get this material in time to duplicate the Secretary of State poll during the 6-month CCC work period. Letter from Archbold to Garfield. I have requested information from Charlie Brown on the Secretary of State poll. We found out that the owner is Joseph Starr of Ketchikan, but have been unable to obtain anything on the story due to his being continually indisposed. We plan to make a trip to Old Tongass after the first year sometime to take pictures and make sketches so that a duplicate pole can be carved for a group at Saxman. Letter to Garfield to Archibald. It is strange that so little seems to be known about the Secretary of State poll. It makes one suspect that there is more to the story behind it than the natives want to divulge, and that they are reluctant to tell the real history. Mr. Forrest may be able to get some of it if he has time. He certainly seems to have the patience. Mr. Heinzman is making tentative plans for me to spend the Easter holiday in Alaska, possibly most of the time at Wrangell. It occurred to me that if it is all convenient or will fit in with the plans for the Ketchikan office, I should like to go to Old Tongass with you. I'm afraid that I would not contribute much, but it would provide me with valuable background for the whole totem pole study. Best wishes to yourself, Miss Archibald, and the staff for the coming year. Letter to Forrest. In a recent conversation, Mr. Heinzelman asked me what had been done towards obtaining the Secretary of State poll from the Old Tongass village. He asked me again to obtain information about this poll right away so that a duplicate can be carved during its CCC work period. Will you bring the old pole to Saxman if it can be moved? Otherwise, photographs and measurements should be taken of it, or possibly the base and top could be brought to the Saxman workshop. 2441, Ketchikan, Alaska Chronicle. A new totem pole will be carved, cut out by a division supervisor for files later sent to Viola Garfield, now in her papers at the University of Washington. A new figure of state will be added to Saxman Park, which already contains a unique reproduction of the Abraham Lincoln totem pole among its many thunderbirds and big bear specimens. The addition will be the Secretary of State totem pole believed to represent William H. Seward, who served as Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, and played a major part of the United States purchase of Alaska in 1867. A.W. Hodgman of the Forest Service Division here and Charles Brown, foreman of the native carving crew at Saxman, returned yesterday on the Ranger 10 from Old Tongass Village, where they obtained pictures and sketches of the totem which was carved at least 60 years ago. The poles include the figure of a man sitting on top of a square figure which represents a bale of fur. It is based on an incident which is said to have happened in the early days when a United States Secretary of State visited with a native chieftain at Tongass Village. As he rose to leave, the chief told him to take the bale of furs he had been sitting on. From the pictures and sketches of the totem, Brown will draw out a rough design on a stripped red cedar log at the Saxman workshop. Then his crew of native carvers will go to work to make the full-size replica of the ancient pole at Tongass. Letter from Archibald to a regional forester. Reference is made to your memorandum dated November 15, 1940, concerning the Secretary of State pole at Old Tongass. We have little success in obtaining a story of this pole. The owner, Mr. Starr, is not very cooperative, and Charles Brown has been unable to obtain information from him to date. I have not received a picture referred to in your memorandum of November 18th. No doubt it will aid in making a copy. At some point, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but they ask if there's any objection to adding another figure. The carvers themselves wish to add another figure at the bottom of the shaft, but the Forest Service did not want that because they wanted a replica of the pole. This is another excerpt from a letter. The carvers wish to add a totem figure. A descendant of the owner, Mr. Starr, will be asked to select the figure and give us a complete story of the pole. To date, he's not been very cooperative, but by some coaxing on Mr. Forrest's part, we may be able to get the story. There's uncertainty even as to whether it was a bentwood box or not. These carvers decided to depict a bentwood box. In this case, it appears. So there was no mention that it was a ridicule pole. Some people might like it not to be a ridicule pole. I've heard it said in Ketchikan that there should be reconciliation and we should forget, or we should move on. So I started thinking about what is it like to hold the instance of the ridicule pole, which did, according to oral history, we know that it was a ridicule pole, and according to other things which I will not read right now, but which are transcribed oral history from earlier, it was a ridicule pole because he did not want to repay the debt that had been given to him. However, it's possible that he did not know that it was a ridicule pole, for he had a very different reception, apparently, as far as has been written and framed, in the Shilkat area, in Klukwan. So I started thinking about the incommensurability often that we find ourselves in with, say, one reception here and the other reception here, and the desire for reconciliation and what that means in terms of what it occludes, what it hides, what it covers. But I had to make the piece, so I'll end with that, more or less. Had to find a log, cut it down. And this was in February. I had about 3 weeks to try to get some work done. I was still in school at Columbia. Got it to a certain point, wrapped it up so it wouldn't dry out, put it on hold. Was going to work on it this summer, dislocated my shoulder while working on it. Had to wait till the next summer when I was healed and able to complete it. But here is Robert, who had been working with me on this piece. This was close to the end of the process. Pushing hard while not knowing, and being comfortable with that uncertainty. Being inspired from pieces which I'm not depicting here, but say argillite pieces, which, this has been framed as a shame pole, but also framed as a ridicule pole. And those kind of things which we know occur in Western art, how is that different when it occurs in Tlingit art, and how does it shift when it occurs toward a Secretary of State, a representative of the nation which had just purchased those people, essentially. Here it is with a crane being raised over the tribal house, which I had shown. The screen that my father had made is inside that piece. He also did the outside piece. Okay, well, didn't include any video. Very dramatic video. Someday someone will put it online of it being raised over. And there is the piece as it stands now. So I think I've gone on, and I would like to, no? 7:55? Okay, a few minutes to get some closing thoughts. But I think I've said them already. I think I've said many of the things that I want to say, and many of the things that I did want to say that I haven't included here. I know that this project is an initiation of sorts. It allows for a different kind of thinking, for me, a return to older pieces, what inheres in these historical pieces, which in my earlier work I thought may be occluding or diminishing the power of Tlingit culture to thrive and to strengthen itself. It's kind of reoriented me into pursuing, maybe with a little more fun as well, a different kind of research, a speculative research, and one that can be found, one that can source itself from the power of these objects about which much is uncertain. So, thank you. As I would be willing to take some questions. I would like to take some questions if anyone has them. Don't feel that the question is inappropriate or shameful, inadequate.
Could you explain, Stephen, ridicule pole and the shame pole, what they are?
Yes, so a ridicule or a shame pole, using those two English words, often are brought into an equivalence, although they are not exactly equivalent in English. They are objects which are made to signify that someone has not paid their debt. If the person has not paid their debt for a sufficient amount of time, then a ridicule pole might be made for them so that they will repay what they owe to those people. I think it's significant to think about that in relation to Seward and the United States. However, there are drawbacks in kind of trying to communicate this kind of take it back mentality, or appearing to do so, because it may distance us and reinforce people's imagination to think that they should be left alone, they should keep to themselves. We don't want to think too heavily about their contribution because they just want it back, and they're just whiners or complainers. So I think there are dangers in having an upfront approach, and I think that this piece kind of, from what I was told at the kind of minimal raising ceremony, was that the Seward family was happy with this piece. Because, we did, Robert, myself, Christian Dalton, who also helped on it, who is here tonight, we did work hard to give this face some feeling based on those portrait photographs. So when one starts kind of trying to empathize, it leaves you in a very complex situation. Yes?
Let's see, I don't know exactly how to phrase this question, but when you're describing something like this and the research, you really appear to be talking about trying to touch a cultural meaning
Yes.
that existed. And, it's something old, and it's a matter of uncovering what is that meaning. And you were saying how somehow that can be uncertain as well. So I kind of get that part of it, but what do you do as a contemporary artist? How do you articulate with these deeper cultural meanings of something like this? Or do you see kind of where I'm going there?
Yes.
And then what do you do as a contemporary artist? And what you were talking about is, are you really constrained? Are you defined by the outside, either it being the authentic Alaska handicraft hand, or cultural traditions, or I'm kind of weaving around there a little bit. Maybe maybe something. Or whatever.
Is there something more direct that you'd like to,
Well,
that you think might help?
What do you do as a contemporary artist if you're starting out with a blank canvas or a cedar log? We can do it that way.
Okay. There are, a number of things that could be responded to there. I guess I'll start with the most direct, the contemporary versus the non-contemporary. As Native artists, we don't want to be constrained. There are many elements in our history which allow for the possibility of our not being constrained if they are taken forward in a powerful and sensitive and intelligent manner by many people, not just one artist. The denial of contemporaneity, the denial of the contemporary to a native through the history of colonization and to a native artist persists and continues to constrain the ways in which that art is framed. That is, our ability to apprehend whether or not something is new is always affected by that legacy of colonization. So, what is a contemporary artist to do? There are many different means through which one can approach relevance. One might say that they have to remove, like I thought that I did, certain elements which could be over-identifiable or too territorialized as native. One could take a conceptual art approach, trying to flip the script, trying to use linguistic devices to talk back and allow people to see the ways in which they are kind of not understanding, or the ways in which their suppositions may lead to the constrictions imposed on others. It's very difficult to try to do it from within the tradition, because it's so often, and this can happen here in Juneau, and especially in the Northwest Coast. I found, being in New York, I realized that for some people, like, the presence of something old or traditional is sufficiently new enough to warrant, like, mania or indifference. It depends. But here in the Northwest Coast, you have people who, well, we have it every day, the hyper visibility of Northwest Coast and native art, which makes it sometimes a little bit more difficult to see the relevance, because we think we already know it. We think we understand it. And native people coming up, a lot of these things which I've been talking about are internalized in various ways depending on each person's situation. But the feeling of obligation to community is always there. You can run, but you can't hide. You can hide. But the hiding in this piece is like, there's an element of fugitivity in this piece. Fugitivity in plain sight, maybe that's an overstatement, but there's an element of fugitivity in plain sight in a lot of historical pieces, argillite pieces, for example, which depict Europeans and are kind of using a conceptual device to speak back to them and ridicule them in that similar way, which is considered conceptual art now. So, that is traditional, that's historical. That power, those means, those methods are found in our rich legacy of the works that are often hidden from many of us. We see the amazing new exhibit here at the Alaska State Museum, and then we were able, through the grace of the museum staff here today, so many wonderful people, to go back and see items which are in the collection, and to hold those items and to touch them and to examine them from multiple angles, things which are denied us. And we also are able to encounter a complex withholding of people like Stewart, Akagi. I'm sorry, I wrote it down, but when I wrote it down, I forgot it. Steward Akagi, who I met today, who is caretaker of these items for the Kagwantan, and allowed us to see them, but for now, no pictures. There are there's so many levels of withholding that occur, but which I guess I could say requires that one go in not knowing. It requires an acceptance of that, an ability, instead of feeling overly discouraged all the time, to let your people strengthen you, lift you up, surround you, and to be okay with holding that open space for yourself. Rosita?
I have to say that I am truly appreciative of Saxman. I am truly appreciative that they commissioned the restoration or a new pole, and that you were the one who were selected to do that. I'm truly appreciative of it. I don't think that when they did the commission that they were thinking about this state of Alaska was going to be celebrating the Treaty of Cession. I don't think, that people were thinking, what was the basis of that pole? What was the basis of the people in the 1940s not wanting to talk about why that pole was there? If you know what was going on with Native people in the 30s and 40s and even up to the 50s and the 60s, Native people were not always talking about the truth, not saying what was happening to them. If you remember that when purchase of Alaska occurred, the Treaty of Cession occurred, Native people met together. Tlingit and the Haidas, all of the clans met and said, if you want to buy Alaska, then buy it from its rightful owners. Who did they pay that money to? They didn't pay it to the Tlingits or the Haidas or all other Alaska Natives. That's what that poll says, is there is yet an unpaid debt. And I know we don't want to talk about that. I know we want to be celebrating wonderful and good things about the state of Alaska. And I have to say, this is so contemporary considering what is going on in this country right now, where everywhere else they're tearing down these statues. And here we are in Alaska erecting one that to Native people doesn't mean the same thing. I don't object to that statue that we have up on the Capitol. What I object to is that the story of Alaska Natives is not there adjacent to that pole. And so I think this pole is so timely, and you've done it so quietly in this state. You've done it so quietly at a time where we're having this 150th anniversary celebration, but we don't see the voice of Native people and the impacts of Native people. I like the word that you said, reconciliation, because that's what we need in the state of Alaska at this point in time, is reconciliation. I'd like to think of this whole as a reconciliation between Native people and others, to deal with the unresolved issues that Native people are still facing. I mean, you raised some of them, like just in the arts where we can't even do arts with unless it's significantly altered. We have to deal with these kind of terms. There's so many things that I think that we should be doing as a state. And as a country, I think, that this kind of, to me, it should be highlighted, that here's something that we could look at a national level. And maybe the state of Alaska could be the one to lead, this reconciliation between minorities and what's going on in the country. So I appreciate it. And,
Thank you.
I know it's a tough work, you know, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. I would like to say just a little bit about reconciliation. Different incentives behind that term, and the ways in which it can do maybe the opposite of what we want sometimes. There's that possibility that we have to hold on to and remember. When I was working on this in Saxman, there was I've heard it said that this should be, that the shame designation, the ridicule designation should be eliminated. There was some effort to dismiss and say that natives have been complaining for too long. They need to basically forgive and forget. That this uncertainty surrounding some of these stories is, well, it was put like this, what I heard, that a carver, so this, I'm just kind of remembering something I heard while working at Saxman, people walking by. So the carver would just tell the story once, and then it was forgotten. Because we weren't there to hear it. This is a non-native person speaking. We weren't there to hear it. Someone might forget here. I might embellish. You might embellish here. We would forget this. Basically fake news. So I'm thinking about different incentives behind the desire for reconciliation and what it can flatten. I think it's important to, if we're thinking about reconciliation, would it still have the ability to operate as a reconciliation device in the manner that you're talking about, Rosita, if it were framed as such? I think it's important to hold those two things at once, to try to. Yes, someone.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing with us and withholding what you chose to withhold and sharing with us the raw emotion that you went through as you carved these. I want to throw up a softball, if you will. Your study of the first, the second, and the third, what is the most significant thing that you restored from the first that wasn't included in the second, or I'll let you take it from there.
Well, I have to say, from my ability to really see the degree of caricature which might have been present in the first poll, the degree of caricature which relied on a sense of realism to some degree, the degree of caricature, possible caricature which might have relied on an appreciation of the person's figures. I went to some degree in that direction with this piece by knowing that they had looked at photos. I tried to go with what I thought of as an original intention, regardless of the problematics of that term original. I had tried to go in a direction that I felt may not have been, for various reasons, may not have been pursued or pushed as far in the second poll. So I couldn't tell whether or not he had a bow tie or, that kind of thing. Those things were probably my addition. But the profile of the profile that Jim Simard supplied, the photograph, allowed me to think that there was some kind of attempt to pursue the features of this person in the same way that I see in some portrait masks of the 18th, maybe 17th even century. And 19th century too. Yeah.
Give me my son
Oh, ouais.
I just wanted to express my appreciation and how you've expressed and how you talk about the totem poles in your artwork. It makes me feel good, and this is my first time I've heard you speak and express your artwork and seeing your artwork. And it was your dad that encouraged me to come and listen to you. I wanted you to know that. And I couldn't sit here and being Tlingit, you have to respond to what you've said, and that your words are not floating around in the air, and that I've heard what you're saying and what you're talking about. And it's very interesting how you brought it forward, and very pleased that the terminologies that you were using as far as withholding and how much do you withhold, so because there's so much we don't want to be troubled. There's so much that we don't want to be, we don't want known, because when it's taken and known, then it becomes commercialized. So I'm very pleased with how you express that. I wanted to just say thank you for your good work and what you're doing, and things that you've accomplished. So now I can see how proud your dad is about you, how he talks about you. Just wanted to let you know that. Thank you.
Ah ouais. Gunnar Chish. I would just respond briefly. Being with you there, looking at those objects in which we were holding ourselves up. It's a hold up to try to research in this way. It's a hold up to try to come up with something new out of what is apparently old. It's a hold up in our time. It's a hold up to grasp weakly at trying to apprehend the language. But we need that hold up. There's another element, just quickly, there's another element of a hold up that I've been thinking about when viewing those objects in the collection. It's like, hold up, wait. They don't love you like I love you. It's a well-known Tlingit song, soon to be. Hold up. Only we care for them differently, and that's okay. That's good. Yes.
On the shame pole, is the idea that Seward was given, I think he came to Alaska in 1869, 2 years after that Treaty of Cession. So is it the idea that he was given a potlatch that he didn't respond to? Or was it that he freed the slaves, or he in Lincoln freed the slaves that some of the Tlingit slave owners were objecting to? Or is it that they paid the money to the wrong people?
Who paid the money?
$7.2 million to the wrong people.
Oh, I think it was very local. There are different responses, very particular responses, which one could go to. Mike Dunham has written a recent book, very great book, in which he does a lot of original research. It's thin. You could read it, find it. But it does say the greatest real estate deal of America. So you have to think about the framing devices there, and think about the possibility that many Tlingit groups have different responses, different ways within their own clans, within their own groups. And in this case, it was very particular that he did not pay the debt that was owed to him. I mean, he did not pay the debt of reciprocating the gifts that were given to him. Reciprocation, very important. So what would it mean to repay? A lot of people, some people have been asking that in terms of, different statues going up. What would it take to pay the debt so that we don't have to think about it anymore? Basically. So I think it's okay that it remains unpaid. That's my own take. The shame that we're talking about, though, is inherent in this kind of in this dynamic of should I complain? Should I say anything about colonization? And that has affected a lot of people, and that continues in the Saxman area as well. It kind of, people who wanted to get behind it, it can cut through. It's a sensitive thing. Family groups can have various opinions about that. Certain people choose to support, certain people will withhold their involvement, but that's okay. It's good that we acknowledge multiple responses, I think.
And it's so interesting how particular you've made, Seward. And did you decide not to put in the big disfiguring scar that he had on his cheek, like the statue at the statue that just went up of William Henry Seward at the court has the big scar?
Yeah, there's a little element of asymmetry in that pole, which perhaps you can't tell in this frontal view, because there is symmetry to his face as well. So, I'm friends with Dave Rubin. He was the one. He's an artist from Ketchikan who made this statue, and we had a few discussions about the scar. And he didn't have the scar at first. He put it in to try to address the complexity of the story, to try to give that statue a component of complexity that people thought that it lacked otherwise. So for me, I noticed that the grain itself, I don't know if you can see on the left side, it's not actually the same alignment of a scar, but there's there was something already there in the wood, just in this particular piece, that gave that feeling to it. So it was already there.
Were those cones on the original pole?
The cones were on the first and second version. I didn't add any.
I mean, that's puzzling in
Yeah.
itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
I don't really have a question, but I have a couple of observations. Maybe we'll stimulate a conversation. But one is that I wonder whether Frank Heitzelman, when he sought to preserve this and have a replica made, if he even knew this. I bet he didn't know this. I bet he was responding to the fact that it was a poem about William Henry Seward.
Right.
Wasn't that, and whole dimension wasn't there. So that's kind of an irony now that's come back, and I think an interesting part of the story. I really like the figure there. I think, first of all, I think the whole idea, the whole concept of a ridicule pole, a shame pole, is bringing back something. It's memory. This is really an artifact of memory that is, old.
Mm-hmm.
And here it is. Here's a new artifact that's bringing that back for another 50, 80 years, 100 years. I think that's really something to think about. The way you've done the caricature of the face and the upper part of the body is very big and very dramatic and very interesting in a lot of ways, but the rest of it is sort of draws on that older figure of slight some components of kind of traditional design, but also very diminutive lower body and feet and knees and all. It's very interesting just as a concept of ridicule.
Right.
To put a human figure like that and shrink it down.
Well, it's interesting. It was interesting for me to work on this piece and think of some of the other challenges I've had carving other pieces in terms of proportion, in terms of, a lot of carved sculpture of the Tlingit Haida. Well, Tlingit is primarily what I'm thinking of, but of the head being larger. There's kind of those things which might seem a little awkward if you're trying to project power. But in this case, there was a different kind of power that ended up taking place. And it was perhaps in the ridicule aspect, which you mentioned, and then I started noticing that, and then looking back at other pieces, form line design, which you start to see a lot more humor, perhaps, in a lot of those pieces, and a comfortability with distortion, a comfortability with moving things into a different realm. And even looking back at oral history and origin stories, you start thinking about, Raven origin stories and how the unknowing about the level of ridicule. This piece allowed for something to come forth which I think was already there. Anyone else?
It's interesting in this very simple form line which you chose to put on the box.
Yeah. Well, this is a problem that I grew up confronting when my father would remake a piece. He'd be like, "Oh, I can't do it exactly," and it became something to think about in terms of when people want replicas. You're noticing how different people want replicas in the 40s, and where that's coming from, and now you have the city of Saxman people and native people wanting replicas, and there are important, valuable reasons for picking each side. Kind of dissecting the reason for wanting that. But the form line design itself for me, it was a chance to play a little bit, but try to make something that had a kind of that showed the attempt to balance within deploying some asymmetry in it as well. So to hold up with an asymmetrical head. Yes.
Can you interpret what the hat signifies there for comments?
So
His station in culture, or
it,
is there usually comments?
yeah,
Are they not?
usually those rings on the top would apparently signify the number of potlatches that hat had been involved in, that clan person had been involved in, as far as I understand. So that's one of the reasons it's puzzling to see this on here. People speculate, was he throwing 4 potlatches? But then you start looking at Haida poles too, and sometimes you have, or maybe think it as well, you have how many potlatches? Or why is this potlatch ring so big? Why is it, so much importance? So if it wasn't a ridicule pole, well, that doesn't really make sense. What would would they be honoring him with having given 4 potlatches? I don't know. So if one interprets that kind of the presence of those rings within a kind of shame or ridicule pole scenario, then maybe there's something of encountering a person who is very full of himself, perhaps, or something like that. Characteristics which have been attributed to Seward, among his other very honorable characteristics. So, I don't know.
symbol on your hat, could that be that he did not get those that he should have to pay back the debt? I'm guessing.
That's one possibility, but it also could, to portray someone who is high up in status, that might be a kind of an analogy, like this is a very important person for his people. That's one possibility as well.
Or he had wealth
Or he had wealth, yeah,
and didn't pay.
wealth to give. They knew he was wealthy because he was making these trips and displaying the wealth in various ways, but with his retinue, but apparently unpaid. Thank you.